What were you doing 7 years ago? What were your dreams and passions? I'll tell you what I was doing. 7 years ago, I started a catalog of all the islands in Magic the Gathering, and something I'm passionate about and need to get publicized is the fact that more than half the islands in Magic aren't islands at all. Let's talk about this. About 7 years ago, someone somewhere pointed out the fact that this island from Lorwyn was actually a river. I would never expect that this idyllic meandering stream would be the card to change the way I perceive the 5 basic building blocks of Magic. Among the so-called islands, this one from Avacyn Restored was also a river, and certainly so was this one from Amonkhet. And like that, the floodgates poured open. A quiet stream turned violent, and me riding its current to this deep dive. It turns out Lorwyn was 17 years ago, more if you're watching this video from the future. And in the 31 years since Magic's release, these wouldn't be anywhere close to the full list of island cards that don't actually depict islands. So 7 years ago, I set off on a journey to fastidiously catalog every time a new non-island was spoiled, every spoiler season adding to this ever-flowing bowl. I don't know when or why I stopped doing this, but I figured now was a better time than any to revisit this idea, with all the talk about Secret Lair of the Strange Sands. Oof. Anyway, join me today on my weekly hyperfixation to figure this out. What makes an island? When did we stop portraying them? And what are the most egregious portrayals? Let's discuss the prevalence of non-islands, what's going on here, and finally end with a breakdown you didn't know you needed. My name is Arcosa, and I make mindful studies of Magic trivia and design. If you like deep dive content, I have a lot of videos cooking up, so make sure to hit that like and subscribe button so you don't miss my video on swamps. The question of what makes an island is a classic one, and this preamble is a message to my fellow pedants. We all know that islands are one of the 5 basic land types in Magic the Gathering. This was a fact established in the very first set. Plains, swamp, mountain, forest, and island were the 5 archetypal biomes or landforms we as players would draw mana from. Second only to forests, the iconography for islands is clear as day. A drop of water signifying what we all know. An island is a piece of land surrounded on all sides by water. Many of Magic's depictions of islands drive this idea home well. Solitary monuments in the distance, encased in a wreath of vast blueness. The land holds lonely but strong, as it withstands the encroaching tide that batters and consumes it. Islands are defined by this interface of land and sea, but if we are to take this definition at face value, what makes these depictions any more islands than, say, the supercontinent Pangaea? 300 million years ago, the Earth we never knew is fathomed to have been one unfathomably large landmass, but topologically still a piece of land surrounded on all sides by water. Let's break this down. In elementary school, we learn about continents, namely one called Australia. The age-old question is Australia an island? The resounding answer is no, because it's clearly a continent. Yet some might still refer to it as the island continent, perhaps even drawing comparisons to the relatively smaller but undisputedly island Greenland. The screaming pedant in you might furiously type out something about tectonic plates, or how islands must be subcontinental, or some other umbrella definition, and believe me, I get it. Geology is a categorical science where we impose criteria onto the structure of the Earth, so it makes sense that we can sometimes get quite strict about these classifications. A more precise definition of island stipulates that it must be smaller than a continent, which would work better if our definition of continent was also more precise. The same way we draw lines that separate the 7 seas, or is it the 5 oceans, or something else, this matter of scale is only relevant to the application. On Earth, our scale is quite fixed with an arbitrary but defined upper limit. Yet, if we look at the official map of Magic's Dominaria, we identify land masses such as Corondor, Shiv, and Sarpedia. It's never been defined whether to consider these continents or islands. In the text, Ixalan is only referred to as a continent, but based on scale and the timeline of the story, it's most likely only a small archipelago. The plain of Zendikar is defined by the fact that its lands constantly shift and contort. Land masses appear and disappear at alarming rates. We might imagine that its spreading seas would blur these lines even more. After all is said and done, the inhabitants of Zendikar have given up on the idea of an accurate map. In other words, the premise of this video is to make a problem out of nothing, and so we won't be using strict criteria, but rather intuition. Pangaea is not an island, and it goes without saying that this isn't either, nor this, or this, or this. If we are to categorize the islands of Magic, we still beg the question of what counts and what doesn't. In Magic's earliest days, the art direction for island cards was quite clear. From Alpha to Mirage, to Portal and Tempest and beyond, these early depictions defined Magic's Platonic form of what an island would be. Their shared silhouette and vaguely tropical aesthetic leave no room for question. This is an island. Along the way, there are some errant imposters like 5th edition 437, Ice Age 368, and the Ice Age snow-covered island, which depict icebergs. This snow-covered island art would later go on to be mistakenly reprinted in Cold Snap on a regular island. Icebergs are not islands because they're not composed of land, and one might argue they're actually water surrounded by water. But other than those, the rest of the 60-some early renditions are faithful to the essence of islandness. Some convey a sense of vastness, while others are smaller eights, keys, stacks, and scaries. Among these examples, I'm quite content in calling these islands. In 1998, Wizards of the Coast commissioned a series of Asia-Pacific lands, which are well known for their heftier price tags, but also for featuring real-life locations. Among the island cards, the first depicts the island of Hong Kong, the second Japan's married couple rocks, Meotoiwa, and the last a satellite of Singapore. 2 years later, the Eurolands would also add depictions of this real-life Danish island, Venice, Italy, and a distant view of the White Cliffs of Dover. We'll return to this one later, but I mentioned these islands because they'll be useful in framing what makes an island. Among the rest of the early islands, here are some of my favorites. The Arena League 1996 printing is quite basic, but adds a bit of flair with a mysterious sea serpent in the foreground. It's part of a set that forms a panorama. The Unglued Island introduces our first showcase frame with an awkward yet charming cliff. Urza Saga 335 royals both sea and sky, and is the first of only a few island cards that depict lightning. There are also some strangely shaped ones like these that are based on atolls, islands that encircle lagoons, and these which were inspired by calderas, hinting at long-forgotten volcanic activity. These examples reveal some of the diversities among islands, but islands nonetheless. It's not until Mirrodin when things take a bewildering turn. Mirrodin marks the first major shift in Magic design as not only the first expansion set to cement the use of the new 8th edition frame, but also a stark transition in tone and story aesthetic. Until Mirrodin, the tales of Magic occurred on distinctly Earth-like planes, from the Saga S Dominaria to its neighbor Mercadia, the backwaters of Ulgrotha, and even the explicitly Earth-inspired plains of Rabaya and the parallel Earth of Three Kingdoms. Everything so far would use a backdrop that resembled Earth to tell a story but magical. And Mirrodin is when we would begin to tell a story but magic. Mirrodin is an inhospitable world where the grass is made of literal knives. The trees are corroding spires of jagged copper. Mountains are forged from slag, and the toxic fumes billow and collect in miasmic pits. Everything in between is a sterile, featureless expanse, plated with metal, the 5 suns overhead reminding us that we are only visitors. Wander far enough and we'll find the Quicksilver Sea, yet another vague mockery of Earth, with these island cards depicting something perhaps island-like but not. Lucky for us, it so happens that the illustrator for 3 of these Mirrodin islands was none other than John Avon, who also famously illustrated what, in my opinion, is the most island that has ever islanded. This is part of our discussion today, an immediately stark contrast of explicitly Earth-like, and explicitly not, between them scenes of earthbound fantasy. This begs the question, how far can we go before our sense of islandness is spent? By all accounts, the so-called islands of Mirrodin sit within a sea of liquid metal, not water, and land they are not. Structurally speaking, they are no more islands than a shipwreck or an oil rig. If ever there was a Platonic ideal of an island, these silhouettes would sit firmly at the borderline. To me, they look more like trees. And so this is the baseline for what makes an island and what does not. Some depictions will be quite obvious, but when it comes to things floating in the water, or heavens forbid the sky, I will put my foot down. If you've made it this far, I'm curious to hear what your favorite island is. In the writing of this essay, I looked through every printing of every basic land, but I might not have included yours in the final video. Let me know. A moment ago, we touched upon 3 of Magic's icebergs. We'll also find them in the snow-covered islands of Coldsnap, Modern Horizons, and Kaldheim. Although it's obvious that icebergs are not islands, our brief stint into Mirrodin makes these seem almost forgivable. At the very least, they're actually in water. And so, this is only the tip of the iceberg that reveals the next facet of things that are not islands. Among them, waterfalls, rivers, wetlands, coastlines, and the ocean itself. Water is wet. The next story block after Mirrodin was Kamigawa, which marked a return from the metal hellscape to a more traditionally Earth-like plane. Although many cite Kamigawa as a failure of a set, pre-Neon Dynasty Kamigawa is one of my favorite settings. It's a mystical, Japanese folklore-inspired world that explores a conflict between mortals and the spirits of the land. Yes, I watch anime, and yes, I enjoy yokai hunting series the most. Among the basic lands of Kamigawa, the first set, Champions, would introduce a series of panoramic lands, such as this quadriptych depiction of the waters above the lake Kamitaki. This is the ancestral seat of the Wizard Academy Minamo, and the inception site of the war between men and gods. Befitting for this mystical place, this series of islands features an impossibly large waterfall, and gravity-defying structures and rock formations. The verdict is still out on whether a floating rock can be considered an island. This Reddit user from 2018 would suggest that a rock hovering above water is breaking every law of physics specifically to avoid becoming an island. And I am inclined to agree, but I will argue that the main focus of these pieces is the background. This would later form the basis of our simply understanding that island cards can be waterfalls. This promo art takes a different angle on Lake Kamitaki. Regardless if you think this counts as an island or not, we would also see a total of 28 different islands over the years that feature similar cascades across many different planes. These Izzet and Simic research facilities on Ravnica, the Roiling Cataracts of Zendikar, the boundless falls of Arcavios, which would later serve as one of the invasion points in March of the Machine, and apparently Jace's birthplace of Vryn, which we know little about. Ixalan features many valleys that overflow with water. These lush, mysterious cliffs are not islands. Nor are these from Innistrad, or Tarkir, or Eldraine, or the Tales of Middle-earth. Even on desert plains, life finds a way, and it is through water that it does so. Throughout the wastelands, Thunder Junction and Amonkhet don't have much room for islands, but these protected oases embody nature's defiance. The waterfalls and cliffs here are also not islands, though water is wet. If we stay a little while longer on Amonkhet, we'll also see another common motif on islands. Amonkhet is a plain that worships water, though its only major source is the river Luxa. Its bounteous flow is reflected on numerous cards, including Amonkhet 251 and 258, Archenemy Bolas 98, these corrupted forms, and most recently our visit in Aetherdrift. As I mentioned in the intro, island cards are also represented with rivers. There's this one from Innistrad and its aesthetic partner from Avacyn Restored. Our later revisit to the Plain During Shadows would show us this one, and 5 years after, Midnight Hunt would give us this. On plains that focus much on the land, it might be difficult to incorporate our traditionally secluded islands, and so we take a much more nuanced perspective, like on Eldraine or Tarkir, or this intriguing art from Neon Dynasty that feels compositionally very similar to this one from Bloomburrow. Some of my favorite depictions of rivers are the Lord of the Rings island, this Secret Lair by Siddharth Chaturvedi, and this one by Andy Williams. Even Mirrodin, for all its crimes against island kind, features rivers made of mercury. This island card from Baldur's Gate comes with flavor text, and it makes me wonder how many people take for granted the flavor that's hidden within these basic lands. Two more rivers come from Lorwyn's Diptychs, its cycle of land pairs that reflect the setting's dual-colored theme. Lorwyn 288 pairs with the mountain on 295, and Lorwyn 289 pairs with the forest 299. The landscapes they combine to form are beautiful, but without an island in sight. Like Amonkhet, Lorwyn is a plain without seas, but it has a more intimate relationship with water. And so let's explore another type of non-islandness. Lorwyn 287 flows into Swamp 291, and Lorwyn 286 combines with Plains 282 to form a marsh. Water is wet, and that's why we see wetlands on so many island cards. Something that amuses me is the fact that Lorwyn's darker half is called Shadowmoor, and like its name suggests, the plain is not unlike one big bog. And so the 4 islands in the set are all just swamps. These two form 2-card pairs with the other land types, plains, swamp, mountain, and forest, but importantly open up our discussion to a few other settings too. Time Spiral introduced us to these dark and dank scenes, with the chaotic stench of rot embellished by the burning crackle of lightning overhead. They contrast the much more idyllic scenes from the plain of Avishkar, which likes to imagine its islands through these swirling wetlands. Ikoria and Eldraine feature large inland lakes, surveying them from far above, while Bloomburrow's setting looks up into a miniature-scale world of wonder. The 4-season cycle of islands from this set is one of my favorites. From this study, one thing is clear: waterfalls, rivers, and wetlands are more common on island cards than we think, and this is by design. Going back to Magic's prehistory, something that's glossed over is why we call these islands in the first place. According to a brief conversation between Mark Rosewater and Richard Garfield, it was revealed that one of the original names for the blue basic was Coast, and Dr. Garfield would even toy with the name Ocean. Like the symbol suggests, the source of blue mana is water, and so it makes sense with the context that we aren't even halfway through all the islands that are not. but we can pick up the pace soon. Admittedly, I find this a pretty unsatisfying revelation. The reason why islands are islands is because of an arbitrary connection of ley lines and land. Plains, swamp, mountain, and forest all describe terrestrial units, and island was chosen for symmetry. At the same time, among waterfalls, rivers, wetlands, lakes, coasts, and oceans, there's no one word that describes a water body in a way that feels natural. Thus, we live with this misnomer. Among the many lands that could have been coast are these that depict tranquil beaches, coves, or oceanside promontories. While you may argue that the White Cliffs of Dover are a facet of the greater island of Great Britain, the focus of this artwork is not of the island itself and only a portion of its coast, and thus I'm not satisfied to call this anything other than a coast. Two other coasts are evident in the secret lair that licensed paintings by Bob Ross depicting tropical sunsets.
Now, let's begin shaping our wave. Grab it and pull. See? Grab it and pull. Isn't that neat? That easy. You can create the shape of this wave. That easy. That easy. There it is.
And a more magical aesthetic is present in the banks of the Theros underworld, this scene of Strixhaven, or perhaps fan-favorite Chippy Coast from the Shard of Esper. While the coast is often a doorway to adventure as depicted in these Universes Beyond printings, it also represents the push and pull of the tide, perhaps best represented in this Brothers War printing, or the raging waterspouts of Zendikar. Like islands, coasts are defined by the interface of land and sea, and so it feels all but natural to have them represent similar slices of the aesthetic color pie. But what if we didn't have this arbitrary connection to dry land? What if blue mana really came from the water? Well, Magic has a history of this too. Here are some islands that focus on the ocean. The stormy pairing of Innistrad 254 and Avacyn Restore 234. Crimson Vow 399 and Midnight Hunt 270. While I really don't like the black and white showcase style in the context of games, this printing catches my eye with its use of contrast and masterful etching. Forgotten Realms and Baldur's Gate show these stormy scenes. And Under the Sea, Dominaria 256 and Jumpstart 46 reveal these hidden reefs. This secret lair conveys what happens if you decide to swim with the fishes, or the dinosaurs. These lands go back to our idea that islands can just be anything in the water, things like hedrons, or things like this boat, this shipwreck, these robots, Godzilla, or this. Or even the hole in March of the Machine 278, or one of my all-time favorites, Battle for Zendikar 259. Being a lifelong resident of New York, I've had the pleasure of visiting the Thousand Islands a few times, and if the upper limit of what we consider an island is Greenland, certainly some places push the boundaries of how small an island can be too. When visiting, I've sailed past the tiny piece of land called Just Enough Room, which only has enough dry ground for but a single house. Is this an island or just a rock? If we go back to our timeline from earlier, we began our downward descent with Mirrodin, then explored the early paradigm shift established in the following Kamigawa block. Naturally then, we have to discuss the block that came after that. Ravnica City of Guilds was released in 2005 and would be one of many visits to this plane-wide city. It would also mark our final descent into madness. The concept behind Ravnica was simple, a street view experience of the 10th district. only one of many bustling boroughs of an unfathomably large megacity. Ravnica is an ecumenopolis, a setting so infrastructurally developed that its city goes from edge to edge. Every vestige of nature has been claimed by something urban. Grasslands are smothered by bricks and mortar, forests torn down and retrofitted into skyscrapers. Everywhere we look is city, city, and more city. In many ways, Ravnica reminds me of one of my favorite real-life case studies of Kowloon-walled city, a city packed so densely that its structures melded into one giant entity, with buildings haphazardly stacked upon one another until nothing is left but another form of metallic hellscape. One of the challenges of a place such as this is the value of real estate. When everything is claimed and the space in between is filled, all that's left is a stifling labyrinth. From the outside, Ravnica's basic lands seem grand, but I imagine them to feel claustrophobic from within, and its islands are no exception. On Ravnica, the hubris of its denizens have even expanded over the sea, and from an art design perspective, the issue of real estate applies to islands too. Thus far, we've equated our sense of islandness with isolation, something remote, something cut off, but on Ravnica everything is interconnected, and thus comes back the motif of water. I imagine the art director of the time just telling the artist to go ham. The original set established the Ravnican aesthetic well, cities built so thoroughly that you can't tell if the water is being redirected or was there from the beginning. Ravnica 294 gives us a glimpse into this aqueduct-like highway system, which we would later see in the DCI promo and return to Ravnica 256. Other depictions in the return set meld with art from our second rerun in Guilds of Ravnica and its associated guild kits. Of these, I find the depictions in War of the Spark the least convincing of islands, though I can see why they chose these vantage points. No other plane uses the city aesthetic quite as aggressively as Ravnica, but these expressions of artistic freedom would later go on to inspire solutions to many urban environments. This printing from Etherdrift is a portrayal of the city of Girapur on Avishkar. Streets of New Capenna represents its islands with canals, as also seen in this more ancient-inspired Lost Caverns printing, and the hyper-futuristic Warhammer 40k island. Water-based infrastructure is also present in Foundations, depicting parks on Arcavios and Neo Kamigawa. This unknown council room from Jumpstart, and some fountains found in Murders at Karlov Manor, Outlaws of Thunder Junction, and Duskmorn. If the idea that blue mana is simply just a reflection of water, Duskmorn also suggests that soggy furniture can be islands too. Some other bewildering depictions are Hour of Devastation 192, a view into one of the pocket dimensions of Amonkhet. Neon Dynasty 286, a physics-defying aerial waterscape. Jumpstart 53, which I probably should have included in the Things in the Ocean category. And Shards of Alara 236, one of my favorite lands of all time that can only be described by seeing it. Here are some more depictions of floating rocks with varying amounts of water nearby, with my favorite among them being the infamous Zendikar Ocean Bowl. These are reverse islands, water surrounded on all sides by land. Perhaps the place where artistic freedom goes a little too far is in the Unfinity planet cycle, or perhaps even in this Mirrodin Besiege printing. Although this art belongs to a panorama, some unfortunate cropping makes it the first island to completely omit liquid of any sort. This one from Wilds of Eldraine is simply a forest. These are glaciers and these are mountains. The final set of islands I have to mention are the most abstract of all. These are often bilaterally loved or hated for their design. Theros Beyond Death 251, Phyrexia All Will Be One 268 and 366, and This Secret Lair by Mark Riddick. I am in the subset of players who absolutely love the text-only basic lands. These also do not depict islands. All in all, there are currently 344 unique depictions of islands in Magic the Gathering. Forgive me if some of these numbers are slightly off, since some of these cases were quite borderline. Even if I didn't mention them directly in the video, I did include them in the following stats. There are 31 islands depicting waterfalls and cliffs, 29 depicting rivers, 22 wetlands, 26 coastlines, and 28 of just the ocean or things in it. Mirrodin and Phyrexia-like lands fill 17 slots, while cityscapes and infrastructure fill 33. There are 14 portrayals of floating rocks, 10 of mountains and glaciers, and 23 that are symbols or other exceptions. This means that among island cards, 111 are unambiguously islands, for a total of 32.27%, just under a third. We can stretch this number a little higher if we loosen our definition of island, but for the purpose of this video, I'm content to say that 2/3 of all island cards aren't islands at all. This is a timeline. This graph shows how many new artworks were created each year. 2003 marks the printing of Mirrodin, where we see our first drastic shift. The years surrounding it mark a low point in new depictions because many of the islands in this period were reprints. The period 2005 through 2007 marks a span that goes through Ravnica, Dominaria, and Lorwyn. We've spoken about Ravnica and Lorwyn's lack of islands, but Dominaria is a special case because this year marks a set that defied the regular Dominarian aesthetic. This set is Time Spiral, and I marked all the islands in this section no's or maybes at best. 2008 is Shadowmoor and Alara. The only island in this year is this one from Grixis. This is a breakdown of the cumulative total of all island cards over the years. Once again, we'll see the uptick in non-island portrayals after Mirrodin, but it wouldn't be until our return in the 2010 Scars of Mirrodin, where half of all islands in the game were finally non-islands. Between 2010 and 2020, the number of true islands doesn't change much, once again because almost all of the actual island art is reprints. 2020 marks the new age of Secret Lair, which is where many fresh depictions would come from. On one hand, I, like many others, find this phenomenon of non-islandness humorous. It's something that we ignore until it's right in front of our faces. But in the end, it is just another tool for Magic to tell its story. The prevalence of non-islands is a reflection of how unique Magic's worlds are, how it bends the meaning on worlds without seas, or plays with shape and composition to give us fresh new depictions every year. It's a reflection of its design history, from early conception to subtle changes over the years. And I hope that you were able to enjoy these concepts as much as I do. If you enjoyed this video, please consider supporting me by becoming a patron so I can make more like it. I make videos about Magic trivia and design and would love your support on this journey. If you haven't already, please hit the like button because it helps so much, and subscribe for more fun stuff. A huge thanks to all my supporters, and I'll see you next time.